Look, it's my great privilege to introduce the first of our professorial public speakers, Professor Bridget Griffen-Foley, who's actually going to be speaking on a topic which is so critically relevant, not only to the Australian context, but to an international context, where we have a media landscape that's rapidly transforming, and we've got these dynasties of media power really still playing really interesting and shaping games within that media landscape. Bridget, just to introduce her formally, is the Director of the Centre of Media History at Macquarie University. She recently joined the department, and we're privileged and honoured to have her. She's the author of 4 books about the Australian media, including The House of Packer, The Making of a Media Empire, and Sir Frank Packer. She's now editing a companion to the Australian media to be published in mid-2014. The title of her paper is Unhappy Families, the Murdoch, Fairfax and Packer Media Dynasties. And just to give you a sense of the proceedings, Bridget is going to give her paper, then we'll have a formal response from Kathy Bale, who's been generous enough to come up from across Sydney to respond to Bridget's paper, and then we'll open it to the floor for questions and discussion. So it's my pleasure to introduce Bridget Griffen-Foley and her paper. Thank you.
Late last year, I was honoured to sign the charter book as a new Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. Just moments before, those attending the Academy AGM had stood for a minute's silence in honour of fellows who had died during the past year. Now the Secretary of the Academy was calling each new Fellow forward individually and solemnly reading out a citation about their scholarly work and achievements. The solemnity ended with my citation, for when mention was made of my work on Australian media dynasties, the word Murdoch was intoned just a little sarcastically, and 200 or so of Australia's most distinguished humanities scholars burst out laughing. I laughed too, and I suspect blushed as my photograph was taken for the Academy's records. As I returned to my seat, I was reminded of another photo and another episode. This is how I began my 2003 book, Party Games, Australian Politicians and the Media from War to Dismissal. In September 1999, I was in Canberra to promote my first book, The House of Packer, The Making of a Media Empire. For years, I'd passed turn-offs to Braidwood and Bungendore as I drove down the Federal Highway from Sydney to conduct research in Canberra. This visit, I finally decided to spend a Saturday exploring the 2 historic towns. Late in the afternoon, as my friend and I headed back to Canberra, we passed another sign that caught our eye. The sign, the back of a sign actually, had been spray painted with the words, Howard and Packer, now that's mateship. Feeling it essential to capture an image of a newly anointed Packer expert standing under the sign, my companion, now my husband, stopped the car and reached for the camera. Other motorists probably wondered why a few words of graffiti were causing such a fuss. For around a century, 3 families, the Murdochs, the Packers and the Fairfaxes, dominated the Australian media landscape. They shared, if not always equally, the public limelight themselves, with the Australian media fascinated by their goings-on. But as the old media struggles to adapt to the new, with declining audiences, converging technologies and changing business models, the traditional spectre of the family media dynasty is also under threat. In Australia over the last 25 years, the Fairfax empire has been lost to the family, and the Packer family has transformed its media interests into a gambling and entertainment business. The Murdoch family business, which became global in the 1960s, is struggling to deal with scandals and succession. I began this lecture by referring to photographs, and it is through a visual prism that I am going to consider the past and present, and perhaps even the future, of the Australian media industry's first families. Through photos, portraits and cartoons, I want to reintroduce you to the members of these competing, at times colluding dynasties, and present a series of vignettes about buccaneers, dynasts, ideologues and financiers. Exhibit 1, Fairfax. The Fairfaxes are our only 19th century family, in newspaper terms at least. Launched in 1831, the Sydney Morning Herald became a daily in 1840. The newspaper was bought by John Fairfax in 1841 and renamed the Sydney Morning Herald the following year. But the newspaper was barely out of its teens before it acquired another name, a nickname to be precise. In 1848, a satirical journal referred in verse to "Dear lachrymose old granny." Liberal opponents were to resort to the nickname with increasing frequency, and it was later to be adopted by readers as an affectionate, if sometimes exasperated, form of address. By the 1880s, other publications assumed such reader familiarity with the nickname that they drew Granny in cartoons. In time, the Sydney Morning Herald itself embraced the nickname. When a column first appeared on the far right-hand side of the front page on the 11th of January 1947, it was called simply Column 8 and signed in an elderly hand, Granny. At the top of the column was a figurehead with Granny's bonnet, mitten and knitting needle, and the hawk-nosed, waspish features of columnist Sidney Deemer. By the end of the 19th century, the Congregationalist Fairfax family were scions of the Sydney establishment. James Reading Fairfax was knighted in 1898. His son, James Oswald Fairfax, was knighted in 1926. They sat for portraits. James Reading for Tom Roberts, and James Oswald for John Longstaff and Walter A. Bowring. The Fairfaxes took up residence in Bellevue Hill before, in 1901, James Oswald bought Fairwater, a two-storied late Victorian mansion looking down over 7 Shillings beach in Double Bay. Exhibit 2, Packer. Family law has it that in 1902, R.C. Packer went to the races and won enough to pay his fare to the mainland. This is how Kerry Packer, ever the punter, romantically relayed this part of his family's history, ignoring the fact that his grandfather had actually been working as a journalist in Hobart for 2 years.
There was a lot of luck in my family's rise. My grandfather was a Tasmanian, and he was broke, flat as a pancake. He went to the races, and he was there, and somebody dropped 10 bob, and I don't know who it was, and he didn't bother to inquire. He dived for it, and he got the 10 bob and put it on a horse. I don't know the name of the horse, but it won at 12-1. So he bought a ticket for New South Wales and for Sydney, and came over and started his career in the newspaper industry in Australia, and he did quite well. And that's where the family started from, 10 bob on a race course.
If the Fairfaxes were old money, the Packers were new, or so it seemed. R.C. Packer's wife, Ethel, had actually grown up in Kilquade House in Wicklow, with circular stairs and a magnificent garden. But her father had died young, his wife was known for her extravagance, and the home had been lost to Ethel's family. In around 1912 or 1913, R.C. Packer purchased his first family home, in Waitara, some 24 kilometres north of central Sydney. For years, Ethel had carried with her memories of Kilquade House, but now she was confronted by a humble brick cottage with a tin roof and veranda. At the side and rear of the house were gum trees and scrub, and the front garden consisted of overgrown grass. Ethel immediately set about transforming the house, decorating the interior with as much taste as her budget allowed, and planting a rose garden more suited to her native island than to Australia. As R.C. Packer's wealth grew via part ownership of Smith's Weekly and some controversial share transactions, the family moved to Sydney's eastern suburbs in the 1920s. But in spite of increased social mobility, controversy seemed to dog them, with R.C. Packer and his son seen as grasping. This undated photo, most likely from the late 1920s, shows Frank Packer, unhappy at how a stall is being run, taking over. The photo was kept by his sister, Kathleen, family evidence perhaps of an entrepreneurial spirit, of the future press proprietor in his shirt sleeves. Meanwhile, Sir James Oswald Fairfax was again sitting for a portrait. One photo of Packer that hasn't survived is of him competing in the final of the New South Wales Amateur Heavyweight Championship in 1928. Beset by nerves when he walked out in front of the large crowd at the stadium in Rushcutters Bay, he was knocked to the floor of the ring in the first round. A photograph appeared in the offices of one of his father's newspapers, Smith's Weekly, showing him lying flat on his back unconscious while his second, Colonel R.J.A. Travers, the circulation manager of Smith's newspapers, waited anxiously for him to get up. Packer never forgave the poet and sub-editor, Kenneth Slessor, for writing the caption, "Mr. Frank Packer fighting in the New South Wales Amateur Heavyweight Championship." 12 months later, Packer, weighing nearly 13 stone, redeemed himself by winning the title. Exhibit 3, Murdoch. The journalist Keith Murdoch had overcome a humiliating stammer and a failed first foray onto Fleet Street to become one of the most powerful newspaper executives in Australia. During World War I, he had written a sensational account of the failed Dardanelles campaign, worked as a publicist for Prime Minister Billy Hughes, and enjoyed the patronage of Lords Northcliffe and Beaverbrook. In 1927, 43-year-old Murdoch, one of Melbourne's most eligible bachelors, was famously struck by a photo in one of his own magazines, Table Talk. The photo of an 18-year-old debutante, Elizabeth Green, would culminate in their marriage. By the mid-1930s, Keith Murdoch had become managing director of the Herald and Weekly Times and had been knighted. This photo from 1936 shows Sir Keith returning from a trip to London with his 5-year-old son and heir, Rupert. A couple of years later, we see Rupert Murdoch with his mother, Elizabeth, and 2 of his sisters peering out from a horse and cart on Cruden Farm, the small farm Keith Murdoch had given his young bride in their marriage. Elizabeth transformed the Cruden farmhouse into a commodious country house in the American colonial style, with one of the finest gardens in the country. There were other, less anodyne images of Sir Keith himself, or Lord Southcliffe as some preferred to call him, in circulation. From the 1930s, the Murdoch press was widely criticised, especially in Labor quarters. Smith's Weekly condemned the would-be press and radio dictator and the dangers of a chain of newspapers with identical policies. In 1935, Murdoch took the lead in amalgamating the existing cable services into Australian Associated Press, of which he was chairman until 1940. There were concerns too about the extent of the Herald and Weekly Times' interest in the fledgling commercial radio sector. Between them, the Herald and Weekly Times and AWA controlled some 24 commercial stations. Newspapers including the Sydney Sun, Truth and the Labor Daily protested against the national menace of a radio dictatorship and an octopus of the air. In 1935, regulations were introduced providing for a maximum of 8 stations to be owned by one company. The regulations had actually been watered down following an outcry from existing owners, including the Herald and Weekly Times. This controversy came on top of Murdoch's alleged role as a kingmaker by encouraging Joe Lyons' defection from the Labor government and his formation of the United Australian Party. In 1936, the Smith's Weekly cartoonist Stan Cross portrayed Murdoch as a puppeteer controlling the Lyons Conservative government. Murdoch didn't bear a grudge in this instance anyway, later employing Cross on the Melbourne Herald. There could have been, but almost certainly wasn't, some irony behind the board of the Herald and Weekly Times' decision to commission in 1933 a mosaic above which appeared the puckish legend, "I'll put a girdle round about the earth." M. Napier Waller's dazzling mosaic featuring gold-flecked Olympian figures was to adorn Newspaper House in Collins Street for decades, before it was acquired by the National Gallery of Victoria. In art, Keith Murdoch emerged as a major art patron and cultural liberal. In 1939, the Herald arranged an exhibition of French and British modern art, which was a famous turning point in Australian art appreciation. That year, he also became president of the Library, Museum and Gallery Trustees, forcing out the conservative J.S. MacDonald and replacing him with Darryl Lindsay. Often overlooked is the fact that that Frank Packer's Daily Telegraph brought the 1939 exhibition to Sydney after negotiations with the Fairfax Company had come to naught. Packer's social standing had risen with his marriage in 1934. Everyone agreed that Gretel Bullmore was quite a catch. She was vivacious, artistic, athletic, and strikingly attractive. Her social credentials were impeccable. She was one of 4 daughters of a Woollahra physician, had attended the exclusive Ascombe School, and holidayed at Palm Beach. The Bullmore girls were regulars in the pages of The Home and other magazines. Gretel's 3 sisters married into wealthy dynasties, including the Hordens and the Hentys. In March 1934, The Home observed that now there's only one Bullmore maiden left for the eligible bachelors to fight over, the beautiful Gretel. From the time Frank Packer had laid eyes on Gretel in the world of parties and dances frequented by the eastern suburbs set, he had pursued her with a single-minded determination. The couple married in Sydney's Society Anglican Church, All Saints in Woollahra, on the 24th of July 1934. They took up residence in Canton, Bellevue Hill. With its rolling lawns, tennis court and garages, the mansion was the basis of what was to become a Packer family compound. This was to be where Gretel was to continue to pose for society portraits. Shortly before the wedding, Frank's beloved father, R.C. Packer, had died. His ashes were interred at the family vault in South Head Cemetery in Vaucluse. His widow Ethel oversaw the construction of the large and elaborate vault, which was topped by a Celtic cross. Not all members of the Packer clan approved of the result, feeling that Ethel had gone completely Irish. There were certain fixtures on the social calendar for wealthy Sydney residents like Frank and Gretel Packer. They holidayed at Palm Beach in January, attended the Royal Easter Show and Easter race meetings in March or April, went skiing in June or July, attended the spring race meetings at Randwick in September and October, and watched the running of the Melbourne Cup in November. Frank Packer embraced polo and horse racing, somewhat more genteel than boxing, with a passion. But in spite of his impressive performance on the polo field, some members of the exclusive polo set were less than impressed by his presence. J.O. Kelly, a mining agent who was married to the children's author and illustrator May Gibbs, recorded that he had enjoyed being a spectator at a polo match, but saying, "The only blot is the large, vulgar, lumbering figure of the Packer animal." Packer had been embarrassed by his large size as a teenager, and it seems that he may have remained somewhat self-conscious about his appearance. It was this sensitivity that seems to have helped to trigger the poisonous hostility between Packer and his fellow Sydney newspaper proprietor Ezra Norton. On the 16th of September 1939, the Daily Telegraph criticised an article Norton's Truth had written about dealings between Germany and Britain. Truth retaliated the next day by publishing 2 photos of Packer, one bearing the caption "approved," the other "disapproved." The article claimed that Packer had taken strong exception to the disapproved photograph, which was cruelly unflattering, that had appeared in Truth on an earlier occasion. Truth alleged that the posed portrait of Packer, bearing the label "approved," had been retouched by artists at Consolidated Press. No photograph survives of the legendary brawl between Packer and Norton at Randwick Racecourse later that month, from which Packer was reported to have emerged hatless, breathless and bleeding from a cut over one eye and marked on both cheeks, his face puffed, hair tousled and clothing in disorder. More established media dynasties like the Fairfaxes, Murdochs and Symes looked askance at these Sydney interlopers, particularly Norton. And there was a clear demographic shift between Fairfax's Sydney Morning Herald and its direct rival, the Daily Telegraph. The Herald was generally home delivered to its largely A and B class readers, attracting lucrative advertising accounts from clients such as David Jones, and it dominated the vital classified advertising market. The Telegraph, by contrast, even before it became a tabloid in 1942, appealed most to C and D class readers in less affluent markets and was sold principally through street sales. There is another photo from the 1930s showing Frank and Gretel Packer with their young sons, Clyde and Kerry. Gretel is gently directing Clyde to look at the camera. Frank is holding Kerry somewhat away from him and looking almost startled, unsure how to handle his giggling infant son. The boys were to have difficult childhoods, with their parents absent for most of World War II and Kerry contracting polio. They were to be looked after by a nanny, sent away to boarding school and brutalised by a volatile father. This is a test of coordination.
It was Kerry's father, Frank Packer, who turned this stroke of luck into a solid fortune, building a newspaper, magazine and television empire that Kerry would eventually inherit. His father's success meant he was born into a world of privilege, but both his father and mother were distant and strict.
He used to sentence me to going upstairs and waiting for him, where he used to come and used to use a polo whip very well. But he never belted me, you know, in all the times, and I got a lot of belting because I wasn't a very good child, but in all the times I can remember that I got a belting from him, I never got one I didn't deserve.
I think it's quite well documented that his father actually treated him pretty harshly, and he was always declared to be.
On the 17th of February 1941, 30 employees and friends were dragooned into hosting a dinner in Frank Packer's honour at the Hotel Australia. The function was designed to congratulate Packer on enlisting as a lieutenant in the AIF and to mark an executive reshuffle at Consolidated Press. In his classic novel Scoop, Evelyn Waugh satirised the dinners held by the proprietor of the fictional Beast. Although Packer was not yet as self-indulgent as the exaggerated character of Lord Copper, Waugh's delicious passage gives some sense of the relationship between a newspaper tycoon and his underlings in the first half of this century. And I quote, "Lord Copper quite often gave banquets. It would be an understatement to say that no one enjoyed them more than the host, for no one else enjoyed them at all, while Lord Copper positively exulted in every minute. For him, they satisfied every requirement of a happy evening's entertainment. Like everything that was to Lord Copper's taste, they were a little over life size, unduly large and unduly long. They took place in restaurants which existed solely for such purposes. The provisions were copious, very bad and very expensive. The guests were assembled for no other reason than that Lord Copper had ordered it. They did not want to see each other. They had no reason to rejoice in the occasions which Lord Copper celebrated. They were there either because it was part of their job or because they were glad of a free dinner. Lord Copper had bought them, hand and foot, with consomme and cream of chicken, turbot and saddle, duck and peach melba, and afterwards when the cigars had been furtively pocketed and the brandy glasses filled with a horrible brown compound for which Lord Copper was paying £2 a bottle, there came the golden hour when he rose to speak at whatever length he liked and on whatever subject, without fear of rivalry or interruption. In 1942, Frank Packer was seconded to serve as Director of Personnel of the Allied Works Council. The appointment was pilloried somewhat unfairly by newspaper rivals, old political opponents and some trade unions. Keith Murdoch's wartime activities were controversial too. In 1940, he served only 6 months as Director General of Information after blundering and alienating his fellow press proprietors, issuing without adequate consultation a regulation requiring correction of newspaper reports in extreme cases. By 1947, the Herald and Weekly Times newspaper and magazine holdings were so extensive that the in-house publication House News ran this page to help journalists identify the editor of some of the company's outlets. At a function to mark the 80th anniversary of the Weekly Times in 1949, Murdoch, wearing a kilt in recognition of his Scottish ancestry, was presented with this montage. There was probably no need to remind his employees that he was chieftain. Following Murdoch's death at the age of 67 in 1952, the Herald and Weekly Times commissioned the sculptor Andor Meszaros to create a plaque for the foyer of the Herald and Weekly Times premises, which were now in Flinders Street. Back in Sydney, James Oswald Fairfax's only son, Warwick Oswald, and Frank Packer were being immortalised by Judy Kassab. With his patrician features and the air of an Oxford Don, Fairfax sat 12 times for the portrait. Kassab recorded in her diary, "After I finished his portrait, he took me and the children to show the puppy he wants to give us. In his car, Johnny asked, 'Gee, what sort of car is this? I wish we would have a car like yours instead of the old Austin.' We turned into Fairfax Road. 'Gee,' Johnny said, 'is that road named after you?' And when we got there, 'Gee, is that a hotel?' 'No, this is my house.' 'How many families living here?' asked my son. 'Only us,' Warwick answered, but he was quite red by then. After the portrait was entered in the 1955 Archibald Prize, Warwick bought the portrait and commissioned Kassab to paint his daughter, Caroline. Not only was the Fairfax family well known, but so too was the company's formidable waspish managing director, R.A.G. Henderson, who sat for Clifton Pugh for the 1965 Archibald Prize. By the time his portrait was painted by Kassab for the 1957 Archibald Prize, Frank Packer had initiated his own National Art Prize. From 1955 to 1959, the Australian Women's Weekly Portrait Prize ran, first with £1,500 as prize money, then £2,000, usurping even the Archibald Prize. Kassab's portrait of Packer depicted, wrote the art critic Elwyn Lynn, a rugged, calculating and self-sufficient man whose repose seems momentary. Packer did not bother going ahead with his agreement to buy the portrait, but regretted this years later. Running into Kassab at a cocktail party for Princess Alexandra in 1967, Packer learned she still had the painting and he bought it for his office, happy to pay an inflated price. He was most likely in a reflective mood, being admitted to hospital the next day with pneumonia. Packer, now knighted, had decided to challenge for the America's Cup in 1962. The world's oldest and most prestigious yachting challenge had never been won by a foreign challenger. Packer commissioned a 12-metre sloop named Gretel after his wife, who had died in 1960. In spite of this touching gesture, he was still capable of joking that he was extremely sorry he had been invited to a stag party, an all-male party, by the Vice Commandant of the New York Yacht Club just a few months after her death. In June 1962, the crew members were driven in a parade through the streets of Sydney, and Packer was presented with the City Standard by the Lord Mayor of Sydney. Typically, Packer, who loved to pile on sail and barge straight ahead, adopted a hands-on approach to the challenge. Although the challenge was unsuccessful, its boldness raised Packer's profile outside of Sydney. Shortly after the challenge, the Melbourne Herald ran a full-page article about him in response to the question, "Who is this man, Frank Packer?" Another publication showed photographed Sir Frank with his sons, telling the readers that Clyde was 6 feet 3 inches and weighed 240 pounds, while Kerry was 6 feet 2 inches and weighed 215 pounds. There was another Australian press proprietor working in his shirt sleeves at this time. Following Keith Murdoch's death in 1952, death duties and financial concerns had forced his trustees to sell their interest in the Courier Mail to the Herald and Weekly Times, meaning that his son had only inherited control of the Adelaide News. With ability and flair, Rupert Murdoch quickly extended News Limited's interest from Adelaide to Perth, and in 1960 he paid £1 million for Cumberland Newspapers, a chain of 24 suburban newspapers in Sydney. The Packers and the Fairfaxes decided not to let this invasion of the Sydney market go unchallenged, joining forces to form another suburban newspaper company. At the same time, Rupert Murdoch was negotiating to buy the Daily Mirror, which had been founded by the late Ezra Norton. Arcane dealings over where these newspapers would be printed led to a punch-up between the Packer forces and Murdoch forces at the Anglican Printery on the night of the 7th of June. While the Telegraph tried to ignore the latest Packer melee, the front page of the Daily Mirror screeched "Knights' Sons in City Brawl." Murdoch did succeed in buying the Daily Mirror, and one of his next major moves was the launch of Australia's second only national daily, The Australian. A photographer captured an image of the 33-year-old proprietor in his shirt sleeves, carefully checking the pages of the first edition that cold winter's night in Canberra. In 1972, Clyde and Kerry Packer persuaded their father to sell the Daily and Sunday Telegraphs, which had never made money for him, to Murdoch's News Limited for $15 million. So Frank's political power was greatly diminished. So too was his health, and he fell out with his elder son and heir. Clyde Packer MLC was to be involved in the counterculture before moving to California in 1976. Here he is, not wearing one of his famous caftans, but being photographed taking a leak alongside the satirist Barry Humphries. Sir Frank made one last public outing to the opening of the Sydney Opera House by the Queen in October 1973. On his arm was his almost regally dressed second wife, Florence. The stylish, half Russian, half French, twice-wed divorcee had made news previously, not just for her style, but for her good fortune. In 1958, the Sunday Telegraph had reported on the winners of the £30,000 Telewords contest. Florence Vincent was photographed alongside Arthur Browning, although there was no mention of the fact that she was, at this time, a Packer family friend, and he was Packer's bookmaker. Also at the Opera House opening were now Sir Warwick Fairfax and his third wife, Mary. In white tie and tails, Sir Warwick is captured hosting a party at Fairwater for the First Lady of the Philippines, Imelda Marcos, who was in Sydney for the opening. The difference between the two nights of the Sydney press was perhaps exemplified by the episode where, when choristers appeared at his mansion to perform Hark the Herald Angels Sing, Sir Frank offered them money to sing Hark the Telegraph Angels Sing outside Sir Warwick's nearby household. Within a few months of the Opera House opening, Sir Frank Packer, drawn here by the Australian artist Ulf Kaiser, was dead. Within a couple more years, his successor, Kerry Packer, was embroiled in a bruising battle for control of cricket.
When Sir Frank Packer died in 1974, Kerry took over the family empire, and 3 years later embarked on the mission history seems certain to judge as his greatest achievement.
I want to make you a few promises tonight. I believe that the final...
The battle was not just about sport, but about the media and about money. Rebuffed in a 1976 attempt to buy exclusive broadcasting rights to international cricket in Australia for his Nine network, Kerry Packer was to sponsor an alternative that split the game worldwide. a fully fledged professional troupe composed of the best players from Australia, the West Indies, South Africa, England and Pakistan, participating in spectacular, often hard-fought 5- and 1-day games in front of his own cameras. Foreshadowing of plans for World Series cricket in 1977 caused indignation in established cricket circles. Compromise negotiations failed. Likewise, an attempt to ban players, which Packer fought in London's High Court. Photos showed Packer briefing journalists, which must have been painful for a media proprietor so protective of his own privacy, in the stands at poorly attended early World Series cricket matches, and as one of the boys in the dressing room with star recruits. Cartoonists depicted Packer taking on the British cricket establishment. Here, I think, were the origins of the image of Packer as the quintessential anti-authoritarian, red-blooded, risk-taking, sports-loving Aussie bloke. A pioneering advertising campaign by Mojo, using the song "Come On Aussie, Come On," might have been written about Packer himself. In the end, he acquired not only the broadcasting rights he had sought, which Nine still holds, but the entitlement to market and promote Australian cricket. Now he was a victor, World Series cricket having made his reputation as a media proprietor. Here is a photo of him back at the office with copies of his new magazine, Australian Playboy, discreetly rolled up. Like many other press proprietors, Rupert Murdoch was busy posing with new newspaper titles too. But there was a new element to the photos of Murdoch, world clocks, for he had spread his empire overseas.
Over Sydney Harbour Bridge by Rolls-Royce, Rupert Murdoch on his way to his office. If the News of the World deal goes through, he'll transfer his base to London. Murdoch inherited the basis of his newspaper empire from his father, built on it and enlarged it to cover every state in Australia. He's chubby-cheeked and open-faced, but underneath, say those who know him, he's a man of steel. Ruthless in getting his own way, iron-willed in seeing that his plans are carried through. If he succeeds in gathering the News of the World reins into his hands, it's likely they'll be in for some pretty aggressive management. Murdoch's Australian empire also extends to the booming...
Here is Murdoch in London with News of the World, the newspaper that would, decades later, cause the biggest crisis in his company's history. Here he is with the Sun and the Times. But this last photo appears to have been taken well before the sale of the most prestigious newspaper in the UK, perhaps to exert moral pressure on the ailing group, which was forced to close the newspaper for a year due to industrial action. Murdoch was to overcome the hostility of the British establishment and the powerful printing unions, acquiring the Times in 1981, and engaging in a bitter dispute at Wapping following the dismissal of thousands of printers and the introduction of electronic production processes. In the UK, Murdoch was to be famously dubbed the Dirty Digger, while in the US, Time magazine was to portray him unflatteringly as King Kong following his takeover of the New York Post, New York Village and the Village Voice. Here he is as a puppet, looking suspiciously like Barry Humphrey's boorish, loud-mouthed creation, Sir Les Patterson, Australia's cultural attaché to the Far East. Back in Australia, by the 1980s, Kerry Packer was a cartoonist's delight. A new motif emerged in 1984. The Costigan Commission alleged, using the codename of the Squirrel, renamed the Goanna in media reports, that Packer was involved in tax evasion and organised crime, including drug trafficking. He successfully counterattacked the Commission with the assistance of his counsel, Malcolm Turnbull. In 1987, the charges were formally dismissed by the Federal Attorney General. But the image of Packer not just with, but as a Goanna was hard to shift. Even if there was some sympathy for his plight. Cartoons about his extravagant gambling habit also began to appear. Meanwhile, Sir Warwick Fairfax died in January 1987. For decades, he had expected that his son, Warwick Jr., would succeed him. One of the most innocent photos to survive of young Warwick shows him aged 5, at his father's side, being introduced to the Fairfax printing press. In 1987, aged 26, young Warwick Fairfax controversially bought out his family's holdings in the company by borrowing heavily. He successfully took it over, but in 1990 the company collapsed and a receiver was appointed with company debts of $1.7 billion. Here was another cartoonist's delight, with Warwick depicted trashing the family newspapers. In the Australian media landscape, the next few years were taken up with Conrad Black's major investment in Fairfax. Packer's 15% share in Fairfax and the bid for control of the company through the Turang Consortium. Again, the story, with all its cross-media ownership and political implications, was told in images. The most powerful and memorable image was from a 1991 Senate inquiry into the print media. Packer reluctantly fronted the inquiry over allegations that he had some secret control of the content of the Fairfax papers.
We got all the photographs done, and then we could get down to actually being serious about it,
Okay.
rather than just being a circus.
Okay. First of all, I declare open this afternoon's proceedings of the print media inquiry, and I welcome Mr. Kerry Packer, the Chairman of the Australian Consolidated Press. Mr. Packer, could you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear this afternoon, please?
Kerry Francis Bullmore Packer. I appear here this afternoon reluctantly.
If you exercise the rights for the preemptive purchase of the junk bond holders,
Packer repeatedly berated the politicians conducting the inquiry and the government. When asked about his company's tax minimisation schemes, he replied, "Of course I am minimising my tax, and if anybody in this country doesn't minimise their tax, they want their heads read, because as a government, I can tell you they're not spending it that well that we should be donating extra." Packer's bid for control of Fairfax eventually failed. Its final throes coincided with the beginnings of the Super League battle. This was the bitter corporate dispute that was fought in and out of court during the mid-1990s between the Rupert Murdoch and News Corporation-backed Super League and the Kerry Packer and Optus Vision-backed Australian Rugby League organisations over broadcasting rights for, and ultimately control of, the top-level professional rugby league football competition of Australasia. Here is a potted pictorial history of Kerry Packer, Rupert Murdoch, tax avoidance, cross-media ownership, and casino policies over the next few years. By the new millennium, the new generation, James Packer and Rupert Murdoch, were being portrayed in cartoons. The pair shared more than just a birthday, sitting on the board of OneTel and persuading their fathers to invest in the company. OneTel became Australia's fourth largest telecommunications company before collapsing in 2001, resulting in not just a financial loss, but huge embarrassment for the Young Turks. In the frenzy of media coverage surrounding Kerry Packer's death on Boxing Day 2005, one image stands out. The Age's Kitty Hill photographed a herd of cattle, paying no heed to Packer and his hearse, as his coffin was driven to his rural property, Elliston, after a private funeral attended by just close relatives. The headline accompanying the Walkley Award-winning photo that read, Kerry Packer laid... The headline accompanying the Walkley Award-winning photo read, Kerry Packer laid to rest in country he loved. The story concluded, so he came home to die in his wide brown land, a wilful and lavish place, as McKellar saw it. In that sense, it was made for Kerry Packer and he for it. And on this ferocious December day, it was the only place for him to be. Here again was the quintessential Australian, a sharp contrast to Rupert Murdoch, who had taken out American citizenship, built an international empire, and tried to wrest control of rugby league from its traditional backers. Kerry had stayed in Australia, unlike his brother Clyde, editor of a book of interviews with Australian expatriates entitled No Return Ticket. For Kerry, there was to be no Packer family vault with its Celtic iconography. The Kerry Packer Dismemorial Collective received little coverage of its plans to protest against the state memorial service held in February 2006. The collective's Kerry Packer good riddance message evoked, probably unconsciously, the front page of the Daily Telegraph Frank Packer had ordered in 1953. The headline Stalin Dead Hooray, accompanied by a caricature of a crocodile crying. On Australia Day 2006, a catamaran on Sydney Harbour was decked out with mock $100 notes and people dressed as playing cards, and a photo of the recently deceased Kerry Packer with the caption, "We miss you, mate." Here were the two sides of Kerry Packer and his father. Hugely wealthy and privileged, but still one of us, not just good Aussie blokes, but in the ultimate tribute, our mates. Now, Cappy may talk about the commemorative issue of the bulletin that came out. There's a little bit of self-indulgence here. This is half of the double-page spread showing Kerry's office on the day that he died. And I am being self-indulgent because I spotted in that photo my book, The House of Packer, and I did subsequently receive a postcard from the journalist Gideon Hay congratulating me on making it into the library of a dyslexic. There was much talk of Packer's legacy, whatever legacy means. Is it money or outlets or power or reputation, or is it something else altogether? Maybe it's denying citizens new media technologies and greater media diversity. Whatever the case, the Packers are protective of their public reputation. In December 2006, the family donated Sir Frank's portrait to the National Portrait Gallery to mark the centenary of his birth. Who knows what Frank and Kerry would have made of Kerry Packer and friends? A small 2010 exhibition of a series by Gina Sinozic, a Croatian-born, Sydney-based artist. The Murdochs are even more fiercely protective of their image, particularly that of Sir Keith. As Tom Roberts showed in the PhD thesis he submitted here last week, the family has controlled the publication and non-publication of numerous biographies, repeatedly publicised Keith's Gallipoli letter, and has worked with Foxtel to commission a series about Gallipoli, focusing on the war correspondence for the centenary in 2015. While the Australian Turf Club awards a Frank Packer plate each Easter, the Murdochs are commemorated through various cultural institutions: the Herald Chair of Fine Arts at the University of Melbourne, the Keith Murdoch Gallery and the Keith Murdoch Oration at the State Library of Victoria, the Elizabeth Murdoch Hall at the Melbourne Recital Centre, and so on. The matriarch was commemorated in numerous portraits and even a commemorative stamp before her death at the age of 103 last year. But for Rupert Murdoch, it is hard to control images such as this. And his own appearance before the Leveson inquiry in 2012, and his even more doddering appearance before a parliamentary committee in 2011, bore no comparison with Kerry Packer's breathtaking parliamentary performance 2 decades earlier. In media terms at least, the Fairfax legacy is a media group unconnected to the Fairfax family. Giving a rare interview from his home in the United States in 2011, Warwick Fairfax Jr., forever to be remembered as the man who lost the family's jewels, was photographed alongside the Judy Cassard portrait of his father. It's a poignant image. A few years earlier, through John B. Fairfax of Rural Press, the family had returned to the company board. But in late 2011, John B. Fairfax and his investment company sold out. Since then, the imagery has been of the company's largest shareholder, Gina Rinehart, trying to force her way onto the board, and of massive job losses due to the digital turn. It is all too easy to speak of the end of an era, as the Herald Sun did on Kerry Packer's death in 2005. However, it is hard not to think of the events of the last few years as representing the end of the era of the family media dynasty in Australia and beyond. In very different circumstances, the Fairfaxes and the Packers have largely vacated the metropolitan media. Less than a year after his family's death, James Packer sold off 50% of his media interests to CVC Asia Pacific in order to focus on gambling. The sale was at the top of the market, yielding $4.5 billion and redeeming Packer's reputation after the OneTel debacle. Only the Murdochs remain substantial media players, with seemingly endless speculation about succession. The buccaneers, dynasts and ideologues who made up the Australian media's first families and were so beloved of cartoonists and artists are largely gone. In their place are private equity, not easy to draw, and unsentimental financiers. Even James Packer is now lean and mean, having lost a good part of his body weight following stomach stapling, and looking entirely unlike his literally larger-than-life forebears. The Murdochs and Packers, together with their wives, girlfriends and offspring, are often now portrayed simply as rich and glamorous. They have become celebrities, sometimes reluctant products of the media their families helped to create and control for much of the 20th century. Warwick Fairfax Jr., James Packer, and James, Lachlan and Elizabeth Murdoch, at last a woman, operate in an era of MBAs of capital markets and shareholder value. Old-fashioned, sleeves-up media proprietors have largely gone, along with their feudal management styles, ruthlessness with subordinates, indifference to chains of command, intuitive sense of the market, and fingertip feel for numbers. Since Kerry Packer's death in 2006, his family and that of the Murdochs have been ripe for nostalgic embrace. In the last 2 years, 2 dramatic miniseries, Paper Giants, The Birth of Cleo, and How's That, The Kerry Packer War, have topped the ratings. In the pipeline are Paper Giants, Magazine Wars, and a prequel, Power Games, the Packer-Murdoch story. A book on the wit, wisdom and wrath of Kerry Packer appeared in 2007, 2 years after his death. He and Sir Frank have made comebacks elsewhere on Twitter. Now it's hard to read Sir Frank Packer. Sir Frank, but I prefer God, from the Taj in Bellevue Hill. Kerry Packer, I'll toss you for it, ? From Canton in Bellevue Hill. Kerry Packer, just effing fix it, Pinhead, from Elliston. And Kerry Packer, I'm still watching. But at least the Packers' headshots are somewhat more flattering than the not Rupert Murdoch account. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bridget, for a really informative and entertaining paper. It's my pleasure now to introduce Kathy Bale, our respondent to this evening's public lecture. And Kathy is Chief Executive of UNSW Press Limited, including New South Books and Publishing, and former editor of the Bulletin and Rolling Stone. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to Professor Jim Piper and to Professor Bridget Griffen-Foley for inviting me to participate in the first of this excellent lecture series at Macquarie. Bridget has given us another enlightening account of our country's media dynasties. Given the current focus in major media companies on present-day survival, it is revealing and salutary to consider the business cycles and characters of the past. I think the lecture was made all the more entertaining by the high number of photographs and cartoons and portraits that were screened. Before I make some general points in response to the lecture, I'd like to give you a sense of my background in media and the points at which I encountered some members of these families. Like most journalists who reach a senior level in media, I worked at some stage for all three family companies, the Murdochs, the Fairfaxes and the Packers. In the late 80s, when Murdoch was launching Sky TV in the UK, I was working on the national daily, The Australian. And while I liked the regular paycheck, I was actually far more interested in a new publication that was being developed in a small office over the road from News Limited's massive Holt Street headquarters. A former Fairfax editorial director, Max Such, and the owner of Rural Press, John B. Fairfax, was starting the Independent Monthly. And it was intended to be just that, a brave, independent voice at a time when the Packer and Murdoch families were dominating Australian media. Unfortunately, Fairfax, after a period of growth and strong journalism, was struggling. Young Warwick Fairfax, who we saw in the image earlier, had bought out other family members, only to bring the Fairfax company to the point of collapse in a very short period. So in 1989, I crossed the road from Holt Street to Kippax Street, and there were plenty of issues for the Independent to investigate. For example, in 1991, it ran a story that revealed a memo from an investment banker that alleged that Packer and Murdoch had a game plan for the newspaper industry. The signwriter, whose work Bridget featured, would have appreciated the detailed evidence in this story of political and business alliances. The Independent Monthly lasted 5 years, And despite the generous backing of John B. Fairfax, it was difficult to get enough advertising and circulation revenue to fully support this venture. My next stop was Rolling Stone, which was part of a family company in America. Its owner, Jan Wenner, was rock and roll royalty. He'd started the company in 1967. By the time I joined, it was in the early 90s, it was a growing alternative media business, which felt like it was a long way from the culture of Australia's conservative media dynasties. I then went on to edit two magazines which were part of Packer's Consolidated Press magazine stable, HQ and the Bulletin. I was fortunate to be there during an era, even though looking back now, that era was coming to a close, but it was a time when there was substantial investment in media resources. Not only did the company back top journalists at these magazines, but there were shows such as the Sunday program on the Nine Network, which also produced some excellent features. These magazine and television stories could have a big impact. They were politically influential. The owner of the company, Kerry Packer, knew how to use these media platforms to his advantage, just like his father, Frank. Several of Kerry Packer's executives had worked with him for many years. When I was there were often parties to farewell staff who had been loyal to the company for decades. Indeed, the company felt more like a court, with Kerry at the top and son James, the next in line, publicly learning the ropes at OneTel and 9MSN, a joint venture with Microsoft. The women in the family appeared at select social events, usually connected to the Women's Weekly. As Bridget accurately noted in the lecture, these media companies were characterised by a feudal and male management style. One of my jobs at the Bulletin was to prepare a special tribute issue on Kerry Packer. The issue was published a few days after he died in 2005, and it was one of the best-selling issues of the Bulletin in its long history. Australian readers could not get enough stories about Packer and his family. 2 years later, in 2007, the Bulletin closed. Packer's company was then under different private equity ownership, and the magazines that remained became footnotes in larger financial negotiations. These days, many of the former ACP magazines are owned by Bauer Media, an efficient global company which, with I would expect, zero tolerance for loss-making titles or low profit margins. December 2006, my first month working at Fairfax on the Financial Review, coincided with the announcement of a merger between Fairfax and Rural Press, whose chairman was John B. Fairfax, the earlier backing of the backer of the Independent. The family once again had a seat on the company's board, but the business was struggling to adapt to the challenges of digitisation and globalisation. And in late 2011, as Bridget noted, John B. Fairfax and his family company sold their stake in Fairfax. I left Fairfax by choice in 2009 to go to UNSW Press. And since then, many of my media colleagues have had that decision made for them. The media business itself has become news. Last week, the latest restructure of Fairfax was announced, with more job losses to come as the share price continues to drop. Last week, Rupert Murdoch, who doesn't spend much time in Australia these days, was greeted by protesters at an IPA event in Melbourne. It was reported that Murdoch was presented at the dinner with a framed portrait by Herald Sun cartoonist Mark Knight that depicted him as a knight in shining armour. I don't think the protesters would have agreed. The tradition of media tycoon portraits continues, and this one could be added to the collection that we've seen this evening. And last week, James Packer, his wife Erica, and sister Gretel hosted a lunch for 100 influential women to raise funds for breast cancer. I'm told there was plenty of information on hand at the event about the family's next casino development in Sydney. As Bridget underlined in her lecture, generations of Packers and Murdochs have been adept at presenting themselves as entrepreneurs with a bold vision for their country, men of the people willing to take on governments. As some of the images portrayed, they are wealthy and privileged, but still one of us. They knew how to create media that entertained. It doesn't appear that the current 40-something generation of these dominant families has the same broad range of interests or media skills. They are simply wealthy and privileged. And our entertainment is now delivered by companies such as Apple, Amazon, and Google. I suspect the next big innovation in media is more likely to come from someone with a passion for digital technology and storytelling, rather than from within one of these legacy media companies. A final comment about archives and the role of universities. Media companies, and this comes from experience, have never been very good at keeping their archives in good order. There's always a story to chase, or another scandal to report on, or another management restructure. So work by historians and analysts, such as Bridget Griffen-Foley, is tremendously important. It provides context and perspective for those inside the business and those outside the business. It preserves images and records of significant events and negotiations. It highlights fascinating periods in our country's political, sporting, and cultural history. And most importantly, it gives us some signposts to the digital future, which we need, because I think it's going to be a very rough ride. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Cathy, again for your entertaining and informative response to Bridget's paper. We are now going to open the floor to questions, discussion. So if I could ask Bridget and Cathy to come to the mic. Questions? Points of observation?
It's fine if there's not any, because I was talking for a long time. And actually, I will just follow on from Cathy's remark about the issue of media archives. It's something within the Centre for Media History that we've been really concerned about. And we established the Media Archives project 2 or 3 years ago, and we have created a database, which is a register of material about the Australian media held in private hands. So that is in companies like Fairfax, but it's also in smaller organisations, community groups, community radio stations, historical societies, and under the beds of old media practitioners. So we're really interested in finding more and more material. We've got over 100 archives in there, but we are looking to expand that so that people at least know where the material is and hopefully are encouraged to follow best practice and continue preserving their material or talking to major collecting institutions.
I think that's great. There's more work to do on the work of the media companies that were discussed tonight, and I think there are 4 books coming out this year on Fairfax. So presumably the authors of those books have done some more digging. I wonder how academics are going to get into companies like Google and Apple, because their information and archives are so tightly controlled. And speaking as a publisher who deals with these companies now, it's often one computer talking to another, and it's actually very difficult to find a person to deal with. So all power to academics who follow this line of inquiry.
And look for Tom Roberts' hopefully book on the on Sir Keith Murdoch and the Herald and Weekly Times. Actually, perhaps we should have a conversation, Kathy.
Bridget, thank you very much indeed for a fantastic lecture. It was really most illuminating. I agree with Kathy's remarks in terms of the visual aspect to it as well. The visual history is really amazing. So I wanted to ask you a question about the post-dynastic moment, and if you would talk a little bit more about that. And also, I was sort of, it entered my mind as well as your concluding remarks and the arc of what we were talking about in the present moment, but also in Kathy's remarks, I wondered if do we inhabit a kind of nostalgic structure in which came out from some of the images of Packers, in the sense in which they're our bastards, and they produce forms of entertainment, popular, demotic, and now are we in this moment where maybe it came out more in your remarks, Kathy, sort of, we're in the clutches of vulture capital, of the kind of private equity markets, and I kind of wondered about that, about the post-dynastic moment we're in, and what are the kind of prospects now, and that we don't know perhaps what's happening with the unfolding of the dynasties, and perhaps the landscape is disorienting. So I'd be interested to hear some more comments, Bridget.
I probably will hand this over to Kathy. I mean, I really do feel that since Kerry Packer died in 2005, we have seen the media dynasties, particularly the Packers, who I do think occupied quite a particular place in the sort of Australian imaginary, for want of a better word. I think we have seen the dynasties really being ripe for nostalgic embraces, as I said, and the fact that there have been, 2 best-selling miniseries, another 2 in the pipeline, with the casting of Sir Frank announced today, Lockie Hume. I think really does sort of suggest that there is, and it's actually interesting though, is they're actually going backwards. So they start in the 1970s and now they're going backwards into the 1960s. So sooner or later we may see something on, the Frank Packer, Ezra Norton kind of brawl. In terms of of the moment for the sort of the post-dynasties, Kathy, would you like to say something about that?
Well, look, I think it's a very good observation. I mean, I did feel when I was thinking about Bridget's lecture, I mean, there was certainly some nostalgia in my remarks, because at the moment, I think publishers are trying to work out how we are going to pay for quality journalism, and book publishers, how we're going to pay our authors and creators. And so I did feel some nostalgia for a period when we had media companies that did invest in this area, and there was not always a commercial return. They found other ways to, make the money, but they did publish magazines and screen shows that provided information of value. So yeah, there's certainly some nostalgia there, and yeah, they were as you said, they were bastards, but they were our bastards. We could identify with them. It was very different to dealing with perhaps more anonymous global corporations who are focused entirely on delivering to their shareholders. So I think we're in transition, aren't we? Because there's evidence of the past, but the money is flowing out of the sort of companies fast and moving into other sort of businesses. So,
and really, one of the things I think that we have lost is media families committed to the media, for all of their eccentricities, their quirks, their bastardry at times. The people I was talking about tonight, most of them were actually committed to the media, to journalism, to newspapers, to iconic publications such as the Women's Weekly. And, we have seen in the last 20 years or so, probably since the events of, the unravelling of the Fairfax media dynasty, in 1990, that we've seen a sort of gradual withdrawal of the families from the media, and I, after I wrote The House of Packer, would sometimes be asked why, I would be asked why I wouldn't sort of do volume 2 post 1974, post the death of Frank Packer, and basically, I wasn't interested enough after Kerry. He at least was still a hands-on, for better or for worse, media proprietor, particularly, and was passionate about TV. But James Packer, before the Paul Barry biography, never held any great interest for me because he's not interested in the media, and we're in a media department here.
John.
Question for Bridget that relates mostly, I think, to the Murdoch dynasty we talked about. Maybe one of the ongoing legacies of Murdoch is his love of the newspaper, seeing he was a newspaper man, and we have photos of him as a young man. And he seems to be single-handedly determined to keep the newspaper going. He keeps the Australian going at a major loss, and he appears to be buying up newspapers in the US and elsewhere. And he seems to want to keep them going in all formats, including print. But do you think you'll be able to succeed in that, or is it doomed to fail?
I really think it depends on how long Rupert Murdoch lives. I do recall seeing him in a documentary a number of years ago where he talked absolutely confidently that he was going to live till over 100. And his mother did, so perhaps he will too. And I think the longer he lasts, the longer the Australian in particular will last, and his titles will actually stay in print in Australia and elsewhere. We are seeing News Corp being split up into the two arms, the entertainment arm and the newspaper arm, and there seems to be part of the reason Rupert has been back in Australia in the last week is not just that really fascinating IPA anniversary event, but also I think in investigating what is happening at his newspapers, trying to spruik the continuing relevance of newspapers, because this division does pose a real threat for that arm, because it's not going to be nearly as implicitly sort of supported by the more profitable parts of the group.
Can I just add too that with Rupert Murdoch's investment in the Wall Street Journal and Dow Jones, that was a significant commitment. I haven't seen the newsroom there, but I am told it's the newsroom of the future. So the investment in digital technology in that operation was massive. So this is Rupert Murdoch backing that part of the the business, whatever it takes. And he has appointed an Australian, Robert Thompson, to run the newspaper division of the company, and he's kept the Australian businesses as in one group as a part of that division. So yeah, I think it is fascinating that he maybe against the odds just keeps pushing this business because it's the one that he knows and loves. Yeah.
But we might just wrap it up there, and thank Bridget for an extraordinary paper. For me, if I can say, I think everyone's marked here that we are at a pivotal moment of change, and that moment is marked by really the dissolution of a whole history of print practice and investigative journalism, and, as you say, that dynastic fostering of journalism. And I think what's so important about the work that you're doing, and Kathy marked this, is this project of cultural memory and cultural history and recuperation of that. And I guess, what we can begin to think about is how we're going to preserve this in the context of the digital media and the inaccessibility and the transitory nature of digital media. And I'm sure everyone saw this week that the British Museum has been legislated power now to actually preserve a digital archive of all the UK publications. I don't think we've got an equivalent in Australia. So even more, the sort of work that you're doing, Bridget, is so urgently important in preserving our national memory. And thank you, Kathy, for giving again an insider's view of the situation in response to Bridget's marking of that dynasty, and also the sorts of fraught moments that we are about to embark on. So we can give a generous and warm thanks to both Bridget and Kathy for their presentation.